What's up? Welcome to Updates with Mr. Warford. This is from our world history people. We're continuing on with the French Revolution. So when last we spoke, the French economy was in the tank. There was resentment over social classes, the three estates, and something called the storming of the Bastille had just happened. Following the storming of the Bastille, we enter an era called the Great Fear. It only lasted a couple months in 1789, but famine is rampant. Unemployment is surging, so peasants are looting the countryside, burning the homes of tax collectors, nobles, and their landlords, and rumors are spreading all over the place that the government's going to overthrow the Third Estate and steal all their crops so they can't feed their families. So a lot of paranoia, a lot of violence going on. So factions start to emerge at the beginning of the French Revolution. More moderate people, kind of people in the more of the middle of these revolutionary groups, were led by a guy named Marquis de Lafayette, and he fought along George Washington in the American Revolution when they sent French forces over to North America to help them fight. And he headed up a thing called the National Guard. It was this militia group or volunteer military group that was formed in response to the Royal Army getting moved into France. A more radical group of people that wanted a change in the French government was called the Paris Commune, okay? And they actually could mobilize neighborhoods for protests, and they were ready for any kind of violent action to further the revolution. They wanted to instigate that. Newspapers and political clubs also formed. Some demanded a complete end to the monarchy. So we're going to scrap this government completely. And they started to spread scandalous stories about the royal family to get more support for their cause. What we start to see is a newly made National Assembly springing into action and making a lot of wholesale changes. So the National Assembly, against the king's wishes, ends the nobility, ends the feudal system. So that second estate of nobles, they agree to give up their hunting rights, their exclusive hunting rights on French land, special legal status, and exemption from taxes. Why did they do that? Because if they didn't, they were probably going to get killed. So they were going to give up that power in exchange for not being persecuted. One thing that's important about the ending of feudalism is that the National Assembly meets a key goal of the Enlightenment. Remember when we talked about the Enlightenment? And that's the equality of all male citizens before the law. Someone was quoted as saying that feudalism is abolished, and that means that France was truly reborn. Along with that, we get the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It was the first step towards a written constitution in France. It was modeled after the American Declaration of Independence that had been written 13 years earlier. We see things like remaining free, equal rights, freedom of religion. Anyone could be taxed. No one was exempt from taxes. Life, liberty, security, resistance of oppression. A lot of Enlightenment ideas within the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Women read the Declaration of the Rights of Man and said, what's missing? Oh yeah, it's us. So in 1791, a woman named Olympe de Gouges demanded equal rights for women in a counter-declaration called the Declaration of the Rights of Women. And she was a big proponent of equal rights for women. And later in the Revolution, women actually met resistance for expressing these views, and many, including de Gouges, were imprisoned and executed. So even though there's a political revolution going on, that social revolution of women's rights had not yet hit its peak. But women were still very important to the French Revolution, because in 1789 we see the Women's March on Versailles. On October 1789, about 6,000 women marched 13 miles from Paris to Versailles in order to force the king, queen, and their children to move back to Paris, okay? People saw Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, as this having this life of pleasure and elegance. In the meantime, they were starving. So they were like, you're going to move from the Palace of Versailles back to France. And seeing that they could get killed if they don't listen, they went with them. So women had a big role in this historical event, the Women's March on Versailles. Also during this time, the church is going to get put under state control by the National Assembly. So under the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790, bishops and priests were treated as elected and salaried government employees. There was a lot of disagreement about this, both among like bishops and priests, obviously, and some of the peasants, or large numbers of peasants, I should say, rejected this idea because they were more conservative and more religious than the people that lived in the capital of Paris. And there was actually a divide that started to happen between the revolutionaries. The people who wanted to revolt against the government started to disagree about issues of religion. The Constitution of 1791 happens, and it changes the government from a limited monarchy from an absolute monarchy to a limited monarchy. So no longer is it just the king. It's the king and a new legislative body that can make laws, collect taxes, declare war, and things like that. More moderate reformers saw this as like, this is all we need. We changed the Constitution. We have a legislative assembly now. Let's write it up. Let's start making these changes. The revolution's over. Oh, little did they know that it would continue and there would be a lot more violence. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is Louis XVI's failed escape. All right, Louis XVI sees the writing on the wall, and he's like, if I stick around here, bad things are going to happen because the country is revolting against me, and I'm basically just a prisoner. I'm sitting here in Versailles waiting for something bad to happen to me. So King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, his wife, the Queen of France, and their children try to escape France in a horse-drawn carriage. Their disguise was uncovered. They dressed as like common people, but they were discovered. And soldiers brought them back to Paris. They were like, no, you don't. You're going to stay here. And onlooking crowds hurled insults at them, called them traitors, things like that. So many people saw that as a sign of weakness. Louis XVI was not ready to go up against this revolution, and he knew that he was going to lose. So that created a sense of pride in the revolutionaries that we're gonna do this thing because he doesn't even want to stay here. So what we're going to talk about in the next coming days is how a more radical approach is going to take root in France. It's going to lead to a lot of violence, a lot of chaos, but also a lot of change. So look in Google Classroom for any assignments or announcements. Have a great day.